Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the world's most exciting classroom event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. We had a pause the last couple of weeks because I was in Australia. I spent most of my time in Sydney and a few other places around New South Wales, and then I flew down to Tasmania for the last few days with a car and my cameras, and I did a little road trip around Tasmania and collected some great pictures and some video clips. In fact, that's some of what I'm going to share with you in today's live event. So the first thing I want to do now that we're back in action with our regular weekly events is to show you where the Oosterschelde is right now. So I am going to share my screen really quickly here, pick the right Chrome tab, and you should see this map come up here. Let's make it a little bit bigger. So you can see the part of the world that we're in. We are in Australia. If I zoom in here, you can see where we just were. We were in Sydney in a place called Darling Harbour, although we did get to sail one day right to the Opera House. I've got that little picture here of the Opera House I can show you. And we were able to dock right next to the Opera House, and we had a day of events at the Opera House with the ship anchored right out front of the big windows. So that was pretty cool. We then left beautiful Sydney Harbour and we made our way to Tasmania, to Hobart. So if I zoom out a little bit more, you can see the path we took. It's actually a very famous race, the Sydney to Hobart race that sailing yachts race each year. We, of course, weren't racing, but we did make pretty good time. We had some good wind. You can see a couple little clips here. See the ship rocking a little bit. Hear the wind whipping through the sails. So we made our way down to Tasmania, this beautiful, beautiful island. It's rugged, it's wild. It's one of my favorite places to visit on the planet. So here we are, tucked up in Hobart. We've got a couple more little things I can share here. Here's a video of us landfall. Our way towards Hobart. And then there's one more little clip here, if I can get to it. There we go, a little image here of the ship, Hobart in the background. And that's where we are now. So we just had a brand new group of Darwin leaders come on board, young conservationists from around the world. And now they are out in the field working with different conservation projects. They are going to learn about the projects. They're going to make some videos highlighting the issue, the solutions that are being implemented right now, and then ideas for the future. Some of the projects off the top of my head, there's whales. I think there's one for Tasmanian devils. There's one climbing some of the biggest trees in Tasmania to look up in the canopies. So we're going to get to meet some of those Darwin leaders as the weeks continue during the DARWIN200. So that's where we are in the world right now. And I'm going to come back from that screen share. And that's where I want to start today, is Tasmania. So I visited Tasmania back in 2007 and had a really great time. And then I was lucky enough to spend the last 5 days before I left Australia to come back here to Canada, exploring Tasmania. So that's what I want to share with you today. We're also going to see a little recording from our Australian event last night, where we had Emma Camp, a coral biologist, join us. We have a new experiment, a curiosity of the week. So we have lots to get to before we wrap up for today. So I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to get right into some pictures and videos to take you on a little adventure through Tasmania. So you should see my screen loading about now. That looks pretty good. I'm going to hide these little thumbnails, and we're going to get right into it. So you saw the picture of the island earlier. This is where we're tucked up right now here in Hobart, and this is where I flew into and started my journey. So over the time that I was there, I had a car that I picked up. I headed down to the Tasman Peninsula first, which is right down here. I then went up and took a ferry to this little island called Maria Island. We'll talk about a little more in a moment. Then I drove all the way up here into the north to a place called the Tasman Arboretum, and then into a little valley called Lungana. And then I spent the last bit of time in this big green section here. This is called the Tarkine. It is a beautiful rainforest. It's wild, it's rugged. There's only a couple roads, and they're dirt roads, they're gravel roads. So it's mostly kind of wild rainforest river habitat. So it was great to spend a little time there. So let's get right into some pictures. I went to the Tasman Peninsula, and the first thing I did was hop in a little Zodiac, a little rubber boat, and we went out to look for wildlife. Now, this is the last chunk of land before you head into the Southern Ocean, and then Antarctica is the next bit of land. And so this is the last stop that humpback whales make while they're migrating. So the humpback whales, they come up the coast of Australia in the summer, they with their young, and they kind of raise them in those nice, calm, warm waters. And then in the winter, they make their way north to Antarctica, to the rich feeding grounds. And they spend that whole winter season feeding on krill in those cold Antarctic waters. So this last little bit of land, this rocky wilderness, is the last bit of land they see before they head to Antarctica. And they were sticking around a little bit longer this year because there was an upwelling of food. So normally they don't eat on their way to Antarctica, but because there's this upwelling of food right off the coast of Tasmania, this big group of humpback whales was sticking around to take advantage of that. So you can see this picture of this one whale about to dive down. You can see its tail coming out of the water. And then I really like this picture. This is a mother and its calf, and they've both got their tails up in the air here. And what's unique about whale tails is scientists use them to identify them. So just like our fingerprints, every whale's tail is unique. They have different bumps on them. They have different notches over the years. And then on the other side, they have different patterns, different white and black splotches. So scientists try to take pictures of the whale's tails because then they can identify them for years afterwards and figure out how they're doing and where they're traveling to. Now, these waters were nice and calm, and the baby humpback whales were really relaxing and playing. So here you can see them sticking their big, long pectoral fins up in the air. You can see this other one here rolling onto its side and kind of waving at us on the boat. And then this gives you kind of an idea of what the landscape looks like. These chunky rocks covered in some green. It's windswept. It's barren. It really is kind of, you feel like you're at the end of the earth almost when you're in these waters. And then the whales were kind of playing around a little bit. So you can see that this is one of the older whales sticking its head out, kind of looking around. And I want to share a little video clip with you because one of the baby whales got so relaxed around the Zodiac that it just started rolling around and following us. So I took a little video clip here that I want to share with you now. So you can see this baby whale, it's still really, really big. It's rolling on its back. It's slapping its fins. It's slapping its tail in the water. You can see it just took a breath there. And then there we go, back under with its tail. And so it was really neat to be so close to this whale. We had our engine off. We were just sitting, trying not to look threatening. And it paid off. The whales got really comfortable around us. And then they came, and you can see this baby was having a great time just rolling around and splashing in the water. And then in a second, you'll see a couple of the bigger whales come through. Probably a male who's escorting the female on their way towards Antarctica. So hopefully one of our Darwin leaders is getting out as soon as today, and we'll be able to see the whales and get some pictures. There's a couple of the bigger whales that just surfaced. And so they kind of come up to the surface, have a few breaths, and when they stick their tails up, they're going back down to grab some more food. So that was what it was like to be out in the little Zodiac and have those humpback whales all around us. It was pretty cool. All right, let's get back into it. There were other wildlife. So you can see this whale tail sticking up there, and you can see the different pattern that it has. But then there's an albatross. So albatross are really unique birds. They can live at sea for up to a year at a time, never touching land. They kind of glide over the ocean waves. They feed on the water. Sometimes they take little breaks on the water like this one is. But they mate for life. So eventually they come back to land. They find their mate, and then they take turns going out finding food for their young. It's really hard for them to take off from the water. They're big birds. Sometimes their wingspans can be 3 meters. So think about that. 3-meter sticks, up to 9 feet. It's very hard for them to take off. They're big, heavy birds, so they kind of run across the water for a while before they get enough speed and lift to be able to take off. These are black cormorants. They're a very rare species of cormorant. They hunt fish in the water. And if you zoom in really closely, they have these beautiful green eyes. Very cool to see. So these are the black cormorants that we saw on the rocks. We saw some birds hunting along the shore. This is a white-faced heron hunting in the shallow waters of the shore. Here are some sooty oyster catchers. They kind of use their bills to probe around and look for tasty things to eat in the sand. And then we saw some of these fur seals. So you can see they don't always get along. This group of 3 here is having a little bit of a fight on the rocks. And then I got a nice close-up of this guy here. Whoops, there we go. And you can see these whiskers here that they can use underwater to help them feel around a bit and find food on the bottom. And then back on shore, I stayed at a nice little cabin that first night on the Tasman Peninsula. And it was fun to watch this fairy wren. Beautiful male here with his blue colors. But it was sitting on the side mirror of my car, and it could see its reflection. So it kept coming back and fighting with its reflection, challenging its reflection in the car. So you can see it's got its tail all puffed up and it's dancing, and it kept flying along the side of the window, trying to scare its reflection away. Now, the next day, I drove up to a place called Maria Island. You have to take a ferry across. There's no cars allowed. And really, all you can do, it's a beautiful island, is hike, and then you can camp if you want to spend the night. So I spent the night, I set up my tent, and I went out walking around to find the wildlife. This is kind of like a wildlife refuge. They took Tasmanian devils and paddymellons and kangaroos and wombats from the mainland, and they put them on this island where they could be safe from human activity and predators and invasive species. And so this island is full of Tasmanian wildlife. It's so cool. So this paddymellon here, you can see it has its baby in its pouch, and it's giving it a little bit of a clean here. And I took a little video because I think you guys might be able to relate to this video when maybe your mom or your dad is being a little overprotective or maybe trying to clean you up after some dinner. So I want to share this little video here with you. You can see here this little baby is maybe not too happy. Like, okay, I get it, mom. I get it. Yep. Okay, that's enough. I'm clean. I'm clean. It's trying to get the mom to stop. But the mom is busy working and cleaning up that baby. So eventually the baby does get free from mom and is able to crawl out of the pouch. So I thought that was a pretty fun moment to see that little paddymellon trying to get away from its mom, who was trying to keep it nice and clean. So if we go back to some of our pictures here, the wombats. So wombats are nocturnal. You usually don't see them until it's starting to get dark or maybe very early in the morning. They come out of their burrows at night, and then they eat grass. They're basically like little lawnmowers eating grass and other green stuff. But it is so safe and predator-free on Maria Island that some of them come out during the day. So you can actually get some great pictures of the wombats during the day. Here's a couple pictures of those wombats. They're pretty cute. And then many of them had babies with them. So it was great to see the babies sticking close to mom as they work their way around and munch on that grass. And I have another little video clip for you of a different mom and its baby. So I'm going to play that little clip here for you now. So you can see they're kind of like round little bears. They're furry. And then you can see the baby sticks really close to mom while they munch around on that grass. So it was really cool to be able to see them during the day. And then when nighttime, as the sun starts to set, even more come out. So when you're walking on some of the trails, there are wombats everywhere. It was really cool to spend some time and to see those wombats. If we go back to some of the photos, there's also these big, beautiful kangaroos called Forster's kangaroos. And during the day, they're awake, but they're kind of laying in the shade. They're in the bush, they're relaxing, they're staying cool. As the sun starts to set, they come out into the open. And again, they're coming out to eat the grass, just like those wombats. And so this is a big male here coming out for the night. You can see the way they have those big, strong back legs. They use those to hop through the landscape. And yeah, as the sun sets, they start to come out into the open. And they're very relaxed. You can see this male here laying down in the grass, the ocean in the background, having a little munch. And I'll show you just how relaxed they are. I have another little video clip here that I want to share. This male was super comfortable with me being around. It was rolling around, having a nice scratch. You can see it's got a little bit of grass in its mouth. And then it kind of looks back at me. What are you doing? What are you up to? Nothing. Okay, kind of boring. All right, I'm going to get back to relaxing. So it was really interesting with the kangaroos. Some of them would let you get really close, like this guy, almost close enough to touch. But others, if you were even 50 feet away, they would hop away really quickly. They didn't want to be close to you. Okay, let's get these pictures back up here and running. Okay, here we go. Perfect. So here is some wallabies. So they're very similar looking to kangaroos, but they're much shorter. They're much rounder. This is a mother and it's Joey, its baby, but you can see this one's almost fully grown. So it probably can't fit in the pouch anymore, but look at the way they watch. Look at the way they look. They're very curious. They're not hopping away, but they're definitely keeping an eye on me, wondering what I'm all about, what I'm up to. So before I get on to the next pictures, I want to talk to you a little bit about a few other things that I was lucky enough to see. One night, I stayed up really late. I went out onto the beach and I went looking for little penguins. So these are the smallest penguins in the world. They live in Australia. Sometimes they're called blue penguins or fairy penguins, but they hunt all day in the water. They wait till nighttime comes. And then when it's nice and dark, they come onto the shore. They waddle back to their nests in the sand dunes, and then they feed their young. So they're very shy, very scared of predators, which is why I had to stay on the beach in the dark for so long. It was a rainy night, so it was kind of cold, but it was worth it because my patience paid off, and I got to see these little penguins. I'm going to play this little video clip. Bothers them. Okay, I see someone saying they can't see the penguins. Hopefully you can see the penguins now. It should be up on the screen. Lambs Elementary, just let me know if the penguins are up there. So I'm using this red light. Perfect, good. Because the bright white light scares them. It hurts their eyes, but the red light helps them preserve their night vision, and it doesn't bother them as much. So here's some of those penguins. They're by a little set of stairs on the beach. I had to go through a little gate, a fence to get down to the beach. And that fence is there so they don't run out onto the road. And it protects the penguins. You can see a couple of them hopping around. Just tiny little penguins. Very, very cool looking. You can hear them sometimes calling in the sand dunes. You can hear the babies calling for their parents. There's a couple of those little penguins. So they've just spent the whole day out in the ocean. And now they're back on shore for the night and they're feeding their babies. In the morning, they will go out again and they will do the same thing. Two of my favorite animals in the whole world live in Australia. They are the echidna and the platypus. The echidna and the platypus are monotremes. They are the most unique mammals in the world, I think, because they're the only mammals that lay eggs. So you only find them in Australia. They have fur like mammals. They feed their young with milk like mammals, but they lay eggs more like a reptile or a bird. And I think that is so cool. So I've got a video of each of them, the echidna and the wombat. So I'm going to start off with the echidna video here. If I pick the right one first, there we go. So here's an echidna that I found on the side of the road. You can see they've got their little spiky bodies to protect them from predators. They've got their little snouts and a long tongue that they use to snuff around and look for ants and termites and things like that. So this is one of the monotremes. It is a mammal, but it lays eggs. They're usually out during the day. Sometimes they're out at the night as well. And when they're scared from predators, they have big, long claws. They can dig a quick hole in the ground, and then all that sticks out is their spikes. And so if you're something like a dingo or a predator, it's really hard to try to bite that echidna because of those big, strong quills or spikes that they have. So the next little video is of the platypus, and I just think the platypus are so cool. So the platypus, this little video clip here, you can see it's got webbed feet like a duck. It's got a tail like a beaver. It has a snout, a bill that looks very similar to a duck, but it's got fur like a mammal. So they kind of dive down, close their eyes, and their bills have electroreceptors. They close their eyes when they're underwater, and then they dig around in the rocks, and their bills can detect little invertebrates, little insects, and other things, crustaceans that they like to eat under the water. So it was very cool to be able to see both of the monotremes, the platypus, the echidna. They're hard to see in the wild, and they're only found in Australia, egg-laying mammals. So, so cool. Okay, I think there's one more little group of pictures I want to share with you, and then I'll see if there's any questions about Tasmania. So let me bring those pictures up one more time, and then we'll take some questions. Here they come. So the last place I visited was called the Tarkine, this wild wilderness. Before I arrived, it had rained for 2 days straight, and in some areas they had more than 100 millimeters of rain in 2 days. So the roads are never good, but they're in even worse condition because they've been washed away in some places. Some of the bridges were closed. The rivers were full. You can see this one river here is full of water, and the only way across this river is on a barge. So this little barge goes back and forth on a cable. A couple cars drive on at a time, and then it brings you to the other side of the river. But the Tarkine is beautiful wilderness. So rainforest coming right down to the river edges. Very few people around, which is how I like it when I'm exploring wild places. And so I stayed in a couple these little cabins. It was an old miners' village here in the middle of this rainforest. So you can see it's almost eerie looking with this brown water, full to the brim, this river, from all the rain. And then the mist is always kind of coming off of the trees and flowing over the river. So it's kind of a wild, primitive rainforest with all these ferns in the background, very green and very thick, so very hard to get through. So that was my awesome time in Tasmania. It is such a beautiful state in Australia. It's so wild. It's so rugged. If you get a chance to visit Australia, I highly recommend that you add Tasmania to the places that you visit. So right now, before we go on to some of our experiments, I want to check in and see if there are any questions about Tasmania, about the place, about the wilderness, about the animals that I was lucky enough to see. We'll take a few questions. We have a few camera groups hanging out with us, so I will bring them in. If you're tuning in via YouTube, send some of those questions in via the chat, and I'll answer those questions the best that I can. But let's start off. We'll bring in our crew, our fourth graders from Lambs Elementary. Hey, fourth graders, how are we doing?
Good.
Very cool. Do you have any questions about Tasmania or those cool animals that we saw?
Eleanor, go ahead. You're gonna have to speak louder. Loud.
Are there any like jellyfish in Tasmania?
So there are, definitely. I went diving, but it was more around Sydney. So I did 4 dives in Sydney, and on a future event, I will share with you guys some of the really cool underwater life that I saw in Australia. But we saw lots of cone jellyfish when we were out looking for the humpback whales. So they're kind of look like little white blobs, but they're really delicate and have all these little hairs on them called cilia that they use to move through the water. And if you look really closely, they make this kind of rainbow pattern as they move those little hairs. So they're kind of cool to see, but they're also a sign that the water maybe isn't as healthy as it could be. So the temperature's been changing. The water's been warming up a little bit more, and that means the jellyfish are traveling further south. So that's kind of an indication that the habitat is changing, more of those jellyfish.
Go ahead, Elijah.
When you saw the echidna,
Yeah.
did you think about the red one from Sonic?
I did not, but the echidnas on this trip were super frustrating. I shouldn't say that because they were doing what echidnas do, but I really wanted to get a nice little video of them. And I tried a couple times when I saw them, but the early times they got very nervous and they dug and they kind of hid. And so I left them alone. I didn't want to bug them. So really, I got a few pictures of just spikes sticking out of the ground. But that last one was very cooperative. And it just kind of walked around and ignored me while I took a little bit of video. So after the first couple tries where it didn't work out, it was nice to get that nice little video clip on the second last day. So I was running out of time to get that video clip. All right, fourth graders, you have one more before I check in with another group?
Go ahead. Yes.
All right.
Why are the penguins at the beach? Shouldn't they be in a colder habitat?
Oh, that's a great question. So there's about 14 species of penguins. Only 4 of them live in Antarctica. So out of all the different species of penguins, only 4 species live in Antarctica. The other ones live in other places around the world. So you can actually find penguins as far north as the equator. When we were in the Galapagos, we saw penguins at the equator, little Galapagos penguins. So actually, you can find most of the penguin species away from Antarctica. So they do live in warmer water, some of them, which is pretty cool. So nice. Good question. All right, Green Acres Academy. I'll bring you in here if you want to mute your microphone. If you have a couple questions about our Tasmanian wildlife or just Tasmania in general, I can grab some of those if you want to unmute.
What was your favorite part about Tasmania?
I think my favorite part about Tasmania is how you can drive around for several hours and feel like you have the whole island to yourself. When you get on some of the back roads, they're just dirt roads. They're nothing but trees and wildlife. So I really like how even in a busy place like Australia, 25 million people live in Australia, there's still places that are wild, and you can still get away from it all and feel, maybe like you're visiting Tasmania, how it used to be in the past. So that's kind of my favorite part, is it's so wild and rugged, and it's so easy to see wildlife, where some parts in Australia, it's a little bit harder. Tasmania is still one of those places where if you're patient and you're not afraid to kind of go out in some of those places off the beaten track, you can still find a lot of wildlife. So that's pretty cool.
Thank you.
No worries. All right. I've got a couple questions here from YouTube, so I'll answer those quickly before we spend a little time with Emma, our coral expert. So, is the air cleaner on Tasmania? Absolutely. There's a place up in the far north. It's called Land's End, and they call it the edge of the world. And they call it the edge of the world because it's the longest stretch in the world where you go from land to the next piece of land. So the waves travel for a long time and they pound against the coast. The air is so fresh and clean there because it's coming from across the entire Southern Ocean. So they call it edge of the world because it's the longest stretch where you go from land, ocean to the next bit of land. So that's kind of cool. It was neat to see that spot. Is it true Tasmania has some of the oldest trees in the world? Yeah, that is true. There's definitely some very old trees in Tasmania. Tasmania also has some of the tallest trees in the world. So we usually think of trees like the big pines, the sequoias in California. The redwoods is some of the biggest trees in the world, and they definitely are. But Tasmania in some spots has some trees that are just as tall. They just look different. And one of our Darwin leaders will be climbing some of those trees with one of our cameramen. So hopefully we get some really cool footage from that. So there's definitely some old trees in Tasmania. Got a question here from Alexis. Which animal did I find the most fascinating to learn about? I'm going to have to go with my friend, the platypus, because they are so hard to see. They usually only come out at night. They live in the water, which, in quiet parts of the river, which makes them even more difficult to see. So they're just such a weird animal that, in fact, when they were their skins were first brought back to Europe, people thought they were a hoax, that they weren't real, because they've got a furry body and a tail like a beaver and webbed feet and a snout like a bill like a duck. And the males even have a little poisonous spur on their back leg. Then they lay eggs. They have a pouch where their young hide out and drink milk. So they are just really cool animals. And the more you look around the world, you see that there are all these cool animals with strange adaptations. And the more you visit new places, you find these animals that you didn't even know existed. So the platypus were definitely my favorite. And I felt really lucky that on 2 different days at 2 different rivers, I was able to spot the platypus. The other animal that's really cool is the Tasmanian devil. And way back in 2007, when I visited, I got to see some in the wild really close up. This time I only saw one at night, and I was in the car driving, and it ran in front of the car. Luckily, I wasn't going very fast. At night in Tasmania, you go really slow because there's so much wildlife out on the roads. And a little Tasmanian devil ran out from the bush in front of my car and then into the other side of the road back into the bush. So that was kind of cool. Okay, so we have to move away from Tasmania, even though it's a cool place. Next week, we'll talk a little bit more about Tasmania. Hopefully, we'll have one of our camera guys join us and talk about the week that they had in Tasmania. And then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other things we did while the Oosterschelde was in Australia. But I want to get to some of our experiments. So a few weeks ago, we had a really cool experiment looking at dinoflagellates. They are single-celled organisms, and when they're disturbed, they have bioluminescence. They kind of glow this eerie, bluey green color. And so Stu, our expedition leader, was able to get his hands on some dinoflagellates and grow them in the Darwin studio. So let's take a look and see how cool the results of the dinoflagellate experiment were. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to see how it looked, how it turned out.
Welcome back, everyone. It's been about a week since I set up my culture of dinoflagellates. During that time, they've been under this bright LED light for about 12 hours a day. Remember, it's really important because they need to get energy from the light, but it's also very important they have a period of darkness to represent the night. The amazing bioluminescent display produced by the dinoflagellates is only visible when it's dark. So let's see if my ones are ready. It's time to turn out the lights. Wow, look at that display! Let's turn the lights back on and find out what happened. Dinoflagellates produce this amazing blue flash by using an oxidation enzyme called luciferase. This comes from the Latin word lucifer, meaning light bearer. The truth is, no one really knows why dinoflagellates produce this amazing blue bioluminescent light. For many years, it was suggested that they produce this light to startle or distract predators that might otherwise eat them. I know if I saw that in the dark, I definitely would be startled and wonder what on earth was making that incredible blue light display. If you look really closely into your culture, you can actually see the tiny dinoflagellates floating in the culture liquid. There's definitely a lot more from when we started this culture a week ago, so they've obviously reproduced quite a bit over the last week. You can actually keep your culture of dinoflagellates growing indefinitely. Every month or so, you need to draw out about a third of the liquid in your culture and replace it with fresh culture medium. This is really important because as the dinoflagellates grow, they use the nutrients and the chemicals within the culture medium. So you need to continually top it up and replace it so they stay nice and healthy. Well, how did you get on? Were you able to successfully culture dinoflagellates and see them make their amazing blue bioluminescent glow? A really good way to capture this incredible display on camera is by using video instead of regular still photography. You can easily pull a still frame out of a video clip And this works much better than trying to get a regular still photograph, because that bioluminescent display is so quick it's very hard to capture at the exact moment when that glow is produced. I'd really love to see any video clips or still shots of your dinoflagellate cultures glowing. Please do send in any that you've got to classroom@darwin200.com. Well done for growing dinoflagellates, and thank you for taking part in this bioluminescent experiment.
Okay, so believe it or not, you could grow those dinoflagellates in your classroom. If you look online, you can order a live culture. You put it in a little bit of water, put it under some light. They grow, they reproduce. And then just like we saw Stu there, when you give it a gentle swirl, you get that reaction where they kind of emit that blue-green light. And like you said, if you did try to grow some in your classroom or at home, you could keep it going for a long period of time. You just have to replace a little bit of the food that they like to eat every once in a while. So really, really cool. We're going to have a brand new experiment before we wrap up for today. But what I'd like to do next is play a little video clip from Emma Camp, who's an amazing coral biologist in Australia. She joined me live last night when we did an event for Australian classrooms, and she talked about how she is working to protect corals from climate change. After we watch the little video clip, we're going to have a Kahoot quiz and see how we do, what we learned about corals. So let me cue up this little video clip. It's about 10 minutes long, and then we will have a Kahoot quiz together. So you should see Emma coming up right about now. Speaker is someone who I've known for years, coral biologist Emma Camp. We have met virtually. She's joined in a bunch of live events with me in classrooms, but in Sydney, I was able to meet Emma in person for the first time, which was really, really cool. She was one of our guest speakers. We had a special event at the Sydney Opera House. The ship was able to park alongside at the Man of War steps and then anchor in Farm Cove, which was really, really cool to have the speakers speaking at the Opera House with the big view out the windows and the Oosterschelde sitting in the harbor. It was pretty special. So Emma is, as I said, a coral biologist. She's a National Geographic explorer, and she is looking for super corals. So corals that can survive raising ocean temperatures due to climate change. Because if we can find those adaptations, maybe we can help protect our corals in the future, because over 50% of them have been lost to bleaching events, ocean acidification, all due to things like climate change and our activities around coral. And Emma is working to secure a future for our incredible coral reef habitats, some of the most biodiverse habitats on the planet. So I'm going to grab Emma in here with me right now. Hey, Emma, how are you?
Yeah, good. Hey, Joe, great to see you. Great to be here.
Good, good. Emma, it's so great to see you. I mean, it's only part of you. It was way cooler to see all of you in person. It is pretty cool to have you here virtually with us tonight.
No, I'm really excited to be here. And likewise, it's great to see what the DARWIN200 team has been up to and following them. And it was great to be in Sydney in the Opera House and meet some of the leaders firsthand.
All right. Well, in a second, Emma, I'm going to let you take over. To the classrooms who are tuning in, use the chat sidebar. Don't be shy and send your questions in. But for now, Emma, let's get into your world. Let's learn a little bit more about the corals that you're looking for.
Fantastic. Okay, let's get sharing. And hopefully you can see that all looks well.
Looks good. Perfect.
Fantastic. So as Joe said, I'm a coral scientist. I work here in the University of Technology, Sydney. I have an amazing team, the Future East team. And we're all really passionate about trying to secure a future for coral reefs. As Joe mentioned, they're under threat. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about what our future reefs look like and what our team's trying to do to buy time and give reefs a chance through looking at these super corals. Now, before I go any further, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and sea countries where I live and work. So the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where the University of Technology is based, but also the KK, Yulanji and Irukandji people, where a lot of my work has been carried out. And just acknowledging them as traditional custodians of language, knowledge and culture, and paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any traditional owners that may be listening in today. So first of all, why care about coral reefs? I think this is so important because it kind of puts in context why I'm so passionate about them and why we need to care about things like supercorals. So globally, at least 14% of the world's coral reefs have declined. But here in Australia, as Joe mentioned, we've been seeing rapid losses of coral reefs, and about 30 to 50% has been lost. Now, that's terrible because over 25% of marine life relies on coral reefs for their survival, but also 1 billion people. So we think of reefs as socio-ecological systems. So many of the poorest communities around the world fundamentally rely on reefs for things like protein, for materials to survive. So that's really crucial. If we think about the Great Barrier Reef here in Australia, it's got a $56 billion asset value, and there's over 100 countries worldwide that have coral reefs. So they're really this critical ecosystem, besides being really beautiful and amazing. Now, unfortunately, coral reefs are declining. So normally they should be these bright yellows and colourful colours. But when stress happens, and particularly warmer oceans, so a lot of the heat that's being generated with fossil fuels gets absorbed by the oceans, and it's really good that the ocean does that, because if not, it'd be a lot hotter on the planet. But it's really bad for the biodiversity and the life in the oceans. And so you can see that the corals turn white. That's why we say the coral's bleached. And that's because the microscopic algae that are kind of, you can think of them like the solar panels of a factory. They take the energy, the light energy, and they create energy for that coral. They leave. They can't survive anymore within the coral. And unfortunately, often the corals end up dying. So the corals can recover for bleaching, but often the stress is too long and too severe, and we see coral lost. And so the prediction for reefs globally is not great. We're predicting that we could lose up to 90% of coral reefs. So how do we do something about that to either slow the decline or ultimately try to reverse that decline? Well, the first thing we absolutely have to do is address climate change. So when I talk about supercorals in a minute, they're not in replacement for addressing climate change. It's the biggest threat to our reefs, and we absolutely have to do that. But even that alone may not be enough. And so that's where we're seeing, what else can we do? Well, marine protected areas. We know that having really good marine protected areas that are enforced, that prevent other stresses like overfishing and destructive fishing practices, are really good to conserve reefs. But again, that may not be enough. We've had marine protected areas in place. We're seeing slowly action on climate change, but we're still seeing a loss of coral reefs. And this is where things like active intervention comes in. So how can science actually try to restore and rebuild the reefs alongside trying to address climate change and conserve the reefs? And so this is really where my exploration and scientific discoveries and interests have come in. I wanted to see, are there corals that are naturally adapted to these stresses that corals are facing under climate change? So specifically hot waters, acidic waters, and low oxygen waters. So this took me during my PhD around a series of different environments with environmental sensors, trying to see what the conditions were. And I found that mangrove corals, so corals living in mangrove lagoons next to coral reefs, naturally live in warm, acidic, and low oxygen waters. So much so that the waters in these mangrove lagoons are more extreme than we're predicting in the year 2100. So this was really one of those like aha moments for me, because these corals shouldn't have been surviving there. They were challenging my understanding as a scientist of what corals could tolerate. So the pictures you can see now are from examples in the Great Barrier Reef, in New Caledonia, and the Seychelles. So around the world, I've gone and I've explored these mangrove systems, and time again, we find corals living there. And so I really want to understand why. Why are these corals surviving when a lot less extreme conditions, corals on the reef are dying? So as I mentioned, they're these natural laboratories. So how do we go about studying them? Well, one thing we do is we put sensors. So that kind of thing that looks a bit like a torpedo in the top left corner, that's an environmental sensor assay. We put that in the water, and it allows us, when we're not there, to measure how extreme these conditions become. And that's really important because things like season, things like tide and time of day can actually affect how extreme the conditions get in these systems. So first thing is to characterize them. And we've done this and we've seen that they really are extreme. And we call them super corals because they've got a superior tolerance to stress compared to normal reefs. Now, the question then is, well, how super are they? How tolerant can they be? And are there any risks with that? So I think anybody that maybe has followed any superheroes, they've typically each got something that's their weakness. So we can think of the kryptonite, for example, with Superman. And so we want to understand actually how super are these corals, but what are the risks for them as well? So the way that we do this is to study the environment. We take some coral fragments and bring them back to our lab to study them there. And we also do something called a transplantation. We take these corals from the mangroves and we put them on the reef, and we take some from the reef and we put them in the mangroves, and we leave them for about a year and we assess them and try to see how they behave and how they change. Now, through doing this, we found some really interesting things. We found that actually these corals from the mangroves can tolerate temperatures several degrees higher when we simulate stress. So that's what we're doing on the right there. You can see we're on the back of the boat. We've got experimental tanks set up and we're basically heating the corals very quickly. And we see that actually the ones from the mangroves can tolerate a lot higher temperature. But what's interesting is when we take the corals out of the mangroves, put them in the reef, so a more stable environment, leave them for a year and then retest their tolerance, they keep their tolerance. So that tells us that it's something innate to the coral. It's something unique about them that they don't lose if they come out of that environment. We found that they have different type of algae. So I said earlier that if we lose the algae, the corals lose their color and they bleach. We found that actually they've got unique algae inside the tissue that adds to their tolerance. So that's part of the reason that they're able to survive. And we've actually found that they're the same species that are found on the reefs, but they have slight differences in their DNA. That means that they express what we would call certain genes and certain traits that are slightly different to the ones found on the reef. And so we're starting to get this big picture of how these mangrove corals are surviving in this environment. So the next part of this then is saying, well, how can we utilize these to maybe build some resilience for the reef? So in 2018, I co-founded Coral Nurture Program. It's a reef restoration program on the Great Barrier Reef, working with traditional owners and the tourism industry. And in this program, we typically use corals that are naturally found on the reef, corals that have survived through previous stress events, which have maybe a bit more superior tolerance. But we're now starting to see how we can integrate these super corals into this practice. Because if we can start to grow up some more of those corals, we can outplant them back onto degraded reefs and hopefully increase coral cover where there's been loss. But importantly, if we can get these super corals to start reproducing, and you can see some examples here of what looks like a witch's hat over some corals. We're actually collecting the larvae that come out of the coral during mass spawning so that we can test them, but also how we can settle them. If we can get these super corals reproducing with some of the natural corals on the reefs, we can start to increase, hopefully, the heat tolerant genes within the population. And this is a process called assisted evolution. It's how can we assist the evolution of the corals in a way that is naturally occurring, but can speed up that process. So it's a long way to go. We have to be very iterative in our approach because we obviously don't want to cause any harm. But because these corals are the same species that we find on the reef, that is really positive because it reduces the risk to any unintended consequences. And we see the super corals as a part of the solution. If you imagine a toolbox of approaches, using these super corals is one tool in that toolbox that can help us hopefully build resilience for the reef into the future. So I'm going to leave it there, and I hope that there are some questions that I can answer, and there's my information. And if I don't get to your question or you think of one afterwards, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
All right. So it's really awesome to have Emma join us last night. She's doing really important work along with one of her colleagues, Jennifer Matthews, who was also with us in Sydney. She's doing some great work on coral reefs as well. If you would like to send a question to Emma, she did leave her email up there. I'm going to back it up a little bit so you can see it better. There it is, emma.camp@uts.edu.au. So if you did have any questions about corals for Emma, you could absolutely send her an email. She said that would be totally cool. And I know that Emma will get back to you with answers to any coral questions that you might have. So we are getting towards the end of our hangout together. It's been pretty fun to talk a little bit about Tasmania and how beautiful of a place it is. We saw the results of our bioluminescence experiment. We had a hangout with Emma. But before we go for today, I want to play a little bit of Kahoot. So I pulled together a Kahoot quiz during Emma's presentation. I'm going to bring it up front and center on our screen here. You should know it now. It is Kahoot.it. 047. There's a few different ways you could join. If you have tablets or Chromebooks at your seat, you could join that way. If you do not, maybe your teacher could pop this up at the front of the classroom. You could shout out your answer to him or her. If you're at home, you can scan that QR code with your phone and it'll bring you right into the Kahoot. If you can't join with technology, no big deal. Play along anyways and see how you do. You don't have to be connected to test your coral knowledge with today's Kahoot. So I am going to give things maybe 30 seconds more to see if we get a couple more groups in here with us. And then we will play our Kahoot. I do see some students behind the scenes trying to get in, so I am going to give a little extra time. I'll talk a little bit about our plan for next week while I have a couple minutes. Next week, we'll still be in Tasmania, so hopefully we'll get a nice live uplink from the ship, and maybe we'll connect with someone like Tom or Josh, some of the camera operators, to see how their time exploring Tasmania went. We also could talk about some of the dives that I did. I was diving with sharks and weedy sea dragons in Australia, so I do want to make sure before the holidays that I share some of that underwater adventures with you. And then it's the right time that maybe we'll have Stuart join us. Stuart McPherson is the expedition leader for the DARWIN200, and it'll be fun to have him come in and join us and talk a little bit about what's coming up between January to July. So January to July, we'll be sailing across the Pacific. We will be in the Falklands. We'll sail across the Atlantic Ocean into South Africa. And then we'll sail all the way up the coast of Africa and Europe until we get back to the UK. So there is still a lot more sailing and exploring to come with the DARWIN200. Okay, I think things have slowed down a little bit, so I think we can get our Kahoot going. Remember, the quicker you put in the right answer, the more points you're going to get, and then we'll see what our podium looks like at the end. So here we go. First question coming your way. How many people rely on reefs for survival? Is it 10,000 people, 100,000 people, 50 million people, or 1 billion people? So how many people around the world rely on coral reefs for survival? 10,000, 100,000, 50 million, or 1 billion? All right, good job, crew. It is 1 billion, over 1 billion people around the world. So you can see why coral is so important. It does all kinds of things. We can get medicines from coral reefs. It blocks storm surge and protects the shore during big storms. It makes money for communities when people come and visit and dive and explore the coral reefs. And then it is a huge food source. So about 1 billion people around the world get their protein from fish. And if there's no fish because the coral reefs have been lost, that is a lot of protein that's going to be missing from people's diet. So coral reefs, for so many reasons, are so very important. So we've got the bronze dragon in first place. I'm going to go to our next question here. It is true or false? Coral turns white when it loses its symbiotic algae. Is that true or false? That coral turns white when it loses its symbiotic algae. You've got about 10 seconds to lock in your answer. All right, good job, crew. That's absolutely true. We call it a bleaching event. So coral is pretty cool because you can kind of classify it as an animal, a plant, and a stone. So it builds these stone skeletons that can build up over thousands of years. It is an animal And it's also a plant because it has a symbiotic relationship with algae. When that algae leaves, because the water gets too hot, it turns white and it bleaches. If the algae doesn't return in a short period of time, then that coral can die completely. We call those bleaching events, when all the color leaves the coral because the algae left. All right, the excited griffin has taken first spot. Another true or false coming your way. Mangrove corals are surviving in colder waters than coral reefs. So corals and mangroves are surviving in colder waters than coral reefs. Is that true or is that false? You've got about 7 seconds to make your big decision. All right, that is absolutely false. In the mangroves, it's shallow, the sun's beating down, the water can get very hot, even hotter than on coral reefs, and even hotter than climate change has affected coral reefs. So when Emma says that those corals have superpowers, she really means it. Those corals and mangroves can survive at higher temperatures than other corals. So if we can help reef corals to adapt to warmer temperatures, then we can help them survive for longer. And hopefully we can get our act together and start reducing the impacts of climate change. So false, mangrove corals definitely survive in warmer waters than coral reefs. All right, excited griffin is still in that top spot. One more question. What's it called when coral reproduces? Is it splitting, growing, spawning, or budding? So what do we call it when coral reproduces? Is it splitting, growing, spawning, or budding? You've got about 6 seconds to make your choice. All right, it is called spawning. So coral has these yearly events called spawning events. It happens at night under certain conditions, and the coral release their eggs. Reproduction occurs, and then the larva drifts through the water until it settles somewhere on a hard surface to form new coral. So it's called spawning. There's these mass spawning events. All right, let's go to our podium. In third place, we've got the gentle seal. In second place, the excited griffin, which means we have a new leader. In first place, we've got the balanced bee. All right, very cool. I'm going to stop that screen share. I'm going to turn off that music. If you are the classroom that contains the balanced bee, oh, looks like my camera froze. I'll have to turn that on and off. But if you are the classroom that has the balanced bee, you need to go to send an email to classroom at DARWIN200.com. If you're the classroom with the balanced bee, send in an email to classroom at DARWIN200.com and we will send you a gift card for your classroom. So bear with me for 1 second. When the camera freezes like this, I need to turn it on and off. So I'm going to disappear for a second, but I'll come right back and we'll finish off with our curiosity.
Welcome back, everyone. Last week, I asked you to try and work out how starfish, also known as sea stars, are related to sea urchins. On the face of it, these look like very different groups of organisms, but actually, when you look closely, they have some clear similarities. They both have a radial pattern, like a star in the starfish. And actually, if you look at the sea urchin, it also has that pattern. Can you see these 5 lines? This is very similar to the body structure of a starfish. They also move around with small tubular feet, and both of them have mouths at the bottom. Starfish and sea urchins belong to the family of echinoderms. That means spiny skin. In the sea urchins, that's really clear and obvious because all of these different species of sea urchins have large spikes and spines that come out from their body. This is really important to protect the vulnerable inner soft parts of the sea urchin that would otherwise be eaten. The spines of starfish are much less obvious, but they actually do have a hardened body similar to the sea urchins. So if you guessed echinoderms, you were absolutely right. The family of echinoderms also includes sea cucumbers, sand dollars that are clearly very closely related to sea urchins, and crinoids. Did you answer correctly and work out that these are both types of echinoderms? Welcome back, everyone. For this week's curiosity, I have these two beautiful marine snail shells. Can you identify what type of snail these are? The name of the species that these belong to? Have a look at their amazing intricate spikes and spines. They're really beautiful. Send in your best guess to classroom@darwin200.com for a chance to win a £50 Amazon gift voucher prize. Join me next week to find out the identity of these two beautiful shells. Good luck and thank you for taking part.